quite taken with Bernard Lewis's little book, What Went Wrong. I was working in the area of the Middle East in the Defense Department in the Northern Gulf. And what began nagging me in my mind was the question, okay, I got it, what went wrong? You can see what went wrong all around you. But why? Why did it go wrong? If you know about the flourishing Islamic civilization, particularly in 9th century Baghdad, where there wasn't another civilization at the time of a comparable level of sophistication other than perhaps the Chinese. Certainly not Europe. With all the promise that was inherent in the achievements of that time, and it didn't end in the 9th century, but how did that once flourishing civilization end up in the close to totally dysfunctional state in which it is today? And that is not I saying that. You can hear this from many Arabs themselves, and particularly if you're aware of the UN Human Development reports on the Middle East. Do you know about those? They began to be published annually around 2001 and so forth, and went on for several years. And the UN, cleverly enough, had only Arab Muslim scholars write this study. And so they marched through every level of human endeavor, the number of patents, the medical care, the level of education, et cetera, and every one of them, the Arab world ended up next to the bottom, but for one, and that one was sub-Saharan Africa. And even there, they made it to the bottom in one of those categories. So GDP, productivity, et cetera, number of books published, the number of books translated, all of this showed a kind of intellectual and cultural implosion. And you began to, what happened? Why did it happen? We know what happened. They speak of this themselves. So I began an investigation that was kind of an intellectual detective pursuit. And it took me many years of reading and chatting, and before I had a eureka moment that my wife reminds me of shouting out, I've got it. I got it when I was reading 9th and 10th century Muslim theological texts that had to do with the nature of God, and particularly with the relationship between God and reason. This being a subject, by the way, which of course every monotheistic faith has had to encounter. What is the relationship between God, Yahweh, Allah, and reason? And various different answers have been given by the different forms of monotheism, and some of them have changed over time. Well, let me recall for you Pope Benedict XVI's famous Regensburg Address. Are you familiar with it?
Oh, yeah.
Have you read it?
Oh, yeah.
Well, you'll recall that the most notorious part of it that sparked riots in certain parts of the Islamic world was when Benedict quoted Emperor Emmanuel II Paleologos, who of course was a captive of Muslim forces at the time, and the dialogue was with his captor. And Emperor Emmanuel was talking about the relationship between faith and reason, and the emperor said that spreading faith by the sword is not according with right reason, and that, open quotes, not acting reasonably is contrary to God's nature, unquote. And Benedict said, this is the decisive statement in this argument against violent conversion. And I say it's decisive because it presumes that God is reason, and if he is reason, then it is immoral to employ force against conscience. Now, Benedict also talks about, in this famous essay, the de-Hellenization of Islam. He also talks about the de-Hellenization of the West. Happened at different times for different reasons. But I think that remark about the de-Hellenization of Islam sort of blew over people's heads because they didn't know there was a period of Hellenization in Islam to begin with. But there was. And it was quite extraordinary. And it happened, I think, for the following reasons. Christianity, as you know, had been Hellenized centuries before. And by Hellenized, I mean it had assimilated Greek philosophy. Plato and Aristotle, and you would see features of this Hellenization in Christian apologetics and the way they would argue about who God is, et cetera, et cetera. When the Muslims conquered the Middle East and North Africa, these were all largely Christian areas. And when they thundered out of Arabia, they had no philosophy, they had no theology. As you know, the Quran was the first written book in Arabic. Certainly there were records of famous Arabic and poetry and so forth, but no book. And so they're ruling over these vast Christian populations, and inevitably the interactions would involve discussions about this is who we say God is, who do you say God is, etc. And so the Muslim intellectuals became acquainted with the style of argument in Christian apologetics, and the same questions therefore arose in their mind. What is the relationship between Allah and reason? And the very earliest theological school in Islam, called the Mutazilites, answered these questions roughly the following way. God has given us our reason to come to know him. We examine his creation, and what do we see? We see in ordered creation that things act for ends, and that the end of everything is ordered to its creator. Now, in examining this creation, we can come to know, for instance, the difference between right and wrong and how to behave. Because what is right will accord with our nature as human beings, and what is wrong will be against it. So we know that behaving well means behaving reasonably. And doing something that is wrong is behaving unreasonably. It's going against reason. The very same terms that Paleologos was to use those centuries later. So, for instance, what about revelation? And by the way, what they said, what we can arrive at is true everywhere for everyone. Not just for us Muslims, it's true for the non-Muslims. If we can know right and wrong, that, according to our nature as human beings, that applies to all human beings. And therefore, by the way, they also said, all knowledge of such things and of nature and science is admissible within Islam. Because if it's true, it doesn't matter from whom the truth comes, so long as it is something that is true, and with our minds we can ascertain this truth. So the rational order in creation, the reason possessed by human beings, and the fact that it all comes from a God who himself is reason, who himself, as is said in Christian revelation, is logos, which is the Greek word for reason or word, right? Or in Genesis, God spoke his word, and his word constituted reality. So reality is permeated by reason, by this rational order. Now, when it comes to revelation, how do we know God has spoken? Well, the first thing you have to figure out is whether there is a God. And the Mutazilite theologians said the first duty of man is not to submit, it's to reason, to inquire, to ask. And it's only when you have established sufficient reasons to say, yes, there is a God, then the question arises, has he spoken? Well, there are various claims to revelation. Has, for instance, God spoken, Allah spoken in the Quran?
Okay, so then I would ask a question. With the violence that you see, just the other day in the Green Village, there's explosions. They tend to believe, they don't believe what you're talking about.
Jack, you're jumping ahead. A couple paragraphs. Wait. Just give me a little. Okay, but all right. I'm still back in the early 9th century.
But let's cut to the chase.
But let me. Well, don't worry, you're next. Thank you. Now, what the heck was I saying?
That's helpful, but you know.
So, what about Revelation? And they say, well, there are things in the Quran here. If you take them literally, can't be true. It said God sits on a throne, that he has hands and feet. And we know from our reason that God is pure spirit, so he can't have hands or feet. He can't be sitting on a throne. Therefore, we are not meant to take this literally, but to understand it metaphorically or analogically. So what the Mutazilites would say is, take those things that are not in accord with reason and bring them into accord with reason. And therefore, that is how you are to understand this. The Mutazilites were sponsored by Caliph al-Ma'mun in the 9th century, who was without doubt the greatest proponent and supporter of Greek thought, perhaps in the history of Islam, at least a ruler. And al-Ma'mun said that Aristotle came to him in a dream. And he asked Aristotle, what is the good? And Aristotle answered him, it is what is rationally good. And al-Ma'mun embraced this answer, supported the Mutazilites, opened the Beit al-Hikmah, the great translation center in Baghdad, which was translating the works of Greek philosophy, etc., into Arabic. And also he sponsored al-Kindi, who was the first Arab Muslim philosopher. What happened next? Well, the second school of Muslim philosophy arose, called the Asharites, after al-Ashari, who had himself been a Mutazilite, but then abjured it. And point by point, he denied everything that the Mutazilites had asserted. He said that the Mutazilites, by the way, were known as the people of God's justice and reason. Because they said God is just, he won't do anything unreasonable, he won't reward those who disobey him, he won't punish. He will punish those who disobey him, he won't reward them. And he'll reward those who do obey him. This is God's justice. And since he's reasonable, he is reason, he will behave justly and reasonably. So we know what justice is. The Asharites said, no. God is pure will and power. He's not bound by anything. It's famously Ibn Hazm in Spain about the 15th century. He wasn't a Mutazilite, but he thought the same general thing, said God is not bound even by his own word. So you go from this idea that God is the word, God is logos, God is reason. God is not bound by anything. He's pure will and power. He can do anything. The idea that you can say God can't contradict himself is because of your own little human mind. God is not bound by such things. And therefore, he may very well reward those who disobey him and punish those who obey him. And this can't be gainsaid. And for you to protest or gainsay it is an act of impiety, it's an act of blasphemy. So this huge struggle begins between the Mutazilites and the Asharites. It was a life and death struggle about which school of thought was going to dominate in Islam. I would say also, by the way, the biggest, most deadly argument that was had between these two schools was concerning the nature of the Quran itself. The Mutazilites said, yes, this is the word of Allah, but it is contingent on history, meaning it was revealed at a certain time to certain people who spoke a certain language, and you have to understand all of these contingencies and cultural influences and linguistic influences to sort of unpack the meaning of the Quran. And the Asharites said, oh no, the Quran has always existed exactly as it exists today, eternally with Allah in his transcendent world, the al-Kitab. And it is not contingent on anything. It is not influenced by anything. It is in no way a historical document. It is an ahistorical document. And to say otherwise is blasphemy. Now, quite significantly, the Asharites also held that man cannot know the difference between good and evil. Why is this? His reason is corrupted through his self-interest. Okay, that's an easy one. But the more profound reason is a metaphysical one. He can't come to know the difference between good and evil because there's nothing to be known. In this very sense, the Mutazilites would say you can know the difference between good and evil because of the nature of things and human nature and the things for which they're intended. Through your reason, you can say this thievery is wrong, that murder is wrong. The Asharites said, no, you can't know any of these things, but only through the word of Allah, only through his revelation can you know what is right and what is wrong. Because reality there are no natures in reality. It is Allah, all-powerful, who constitutes things what they are instantaneously and in the moment. They had this atomistic metaphysics that there are these sort of particles, atoms of time and space, none of which have any relationship with each other, that Allah agglomerates in any given moment to create this glass. But it's only a glass for the instant in which his will makes it one. And if you say it's going to be a glass in the next instance, because it has the nature of a glass, shirk. That's blasphemy. Because you are saying that God is not, in their minds, omnipotent. It is only he who wills things to be what they are. And in the next instant, he may change his mind and say, it's not a glass, it's a giraffe. And so there is no, reality is no longer apprehensible in this rational way of discerning what things that are their natures and therefore coming to know what they are. You can only know these things through revelation. There's a very interesting moment in the Quran, in the creation narrative. For instance, who names the animals in Genesis?
Adam.
Who names the animals in the Quran?
Allah.
Allah. So it's Allah who names the animals. Man hasn't the capability of saying what those animals are. It's Allah who does it. And after this scene, the angels are complaining to Allah, saying, why have you made this man, this clump of dirt, who is going to cause such mischief? And Allah says, oh yeah? Well, let's see how much you know. You tell me the names of the animals. And the angels answer, oh, Allah, you who know all, know that we don't know what the animals are, the names of the animals are. We only know what you tell us. So even these angels, these creatures of pure intelligence, haven't the capability to apprehend with their intelligence what things are. That's what naming is. It's the apprehension of what something is. So even at the spiritual level of angels, they haven't that capacity. And so you see at least this little hint of something like this in the Asharite view of things. So this atomistic metaphysical view of things also removes cause and effect from the natural world. What just happened?
Gravity.
Shirk. Anyone else? Thank you. Yeah, shirk. Anyone who said this is gravity, shirk, you've all committed blasphemy. It only hit the podium because God moved it there. And for you to say it happened for any other reason, that gravity is a law of the natural world, is shirk. It's blasphemy. And this obtains to absolutely everything. Next time he may cause it to go to the ceiling or hit Warren Coates on the head. Whatever happens is what he wishes to happen because he's constituted by pure will. You know, there's a famous debates in Christianity and elsewhere that you would hear, for instance, someone like Thomas Aquinas saying God's reason precedes his will, or his divine wisdom or his intelligence. It precedes his will. In other words, he's making the point that the will through which God acts to create something first exists as reason. So that the will is the servant of the reason. Now you find in this school of theology, the relationship is flipped. That it's the will that precedes, the will that is primary over reason. It's not as if, by the way, the Asherites wouldn't say God can act reasonably, or what we would find reasonably, whenever he wills to. Sure enough, but that doesn't mean he won't act unreasonably, or what we think of as unreasonably, whenever he so desires. In other words, it's totally arbitrary. And so it is throughout the attributes of Allah that are listed and how the Asherites understood them. The Mutazilites would say absolutely not. God can't act unreasonably because he is reason. That would be denying his own nature. So do you see the huge conflict in these two opposing views of who Allah is? And I could read to you things from Muslim debates about these issues that would take the hair off your head. I mean, they are very startling, in a way hard to believe. If we have time, I'd be happy to read some of them to you. But this school of thought reaches its apogee in Al-Ghazali, who is considered to this day in the Arab Muslim world as second only to Muhammad. That is how influential Al-Ghazali continues to be. Al-Ghazali wrote a very famous book toward the end of the 12th century called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, in which he systematically takes apart Aristotle and Plato and says they don't really know anything, and therefore what philosophy is not what it says it is, it's just another faith. And it's not the faith of Islam. So Aristotle and Plato, they're haram. He reads philosophy out of Islam. Now, about a century later, one of the great Muslim philosophers, Ibn Rushd of Averroes, writes a counter to Al-Ghazali. Remember, his book is The Incoherence of the Philosophers. Averroes writes The Incoherence of the Incoherence. And it's a line-by-line critique of Al-Ghazali. And it's a delicious book to read. The problem is, it was too late. And in fact, in Cordoba, one of the great Muslim centers, the great library of Cordoba, in Spain, thank you. My wife is Spanish, but I appreciate the prompt. And I went to Cordoba to see some of the Muslim sites there. But it was Averroes' books that were taken into the town square and burned, and he had to flee. I trace in my work the consequences of this, the triumph of Asharism in the Arab Muslim world, where it remains today the majority theological school. Sorry, among Sunnis. I'm sorry, I should have, qualified. Among Sunnis, it's a Sunni theological school. Fazlur Rahman was a great writer, professor, teacher, from India, Pakistan. He returned to Pakistan to be a minister and try to guide their education system. His thinking wasn't welcome. He was basically driven out. He went to the University of Chicago, where he taught for many years. Some of my friends got their PhDs under Fazlur Rahman. I've read every book of his. He said something that caught my attention, and this will help you to understand why I had the effrontery to title my book, The Closing of the Muslim Mind. Fazlur Rahman wrote, a people, quote, a people that deprives itself of philosophy necessarily exposes itself to starvation in terms of fresh ideas. In fact, it commits intellectual suicide, unquote. And this is what I try to trace, but I thought the most important thing was to capture what the origins of this problem that has produced such widespread dysfunction. I'm just give you a sample again. For one of the last great Mutazilite teachers was Abdul-Jabbar. We have a more or less complete account of Mutazilite's teachings because I forget whether this was in Sudan. They found in the corner of some mosque a treasure trove of his teachings, which were then subsequently translated after the 1950s. A lot of their stuff, of course, was burned at the time they lost the struggle. By the way, why did they lose the struggle? This is very long for introductory remarks, isn't it? Because none of you are getting to the... I'll jump forward for Jack's sake. But the reason they lost was the three caliphs after Al-Mamun, a caliph Al-Mutawakkil, switched and said, now no Mutazilism, in fact, no philosophy. And the Mutazilites had to basically run for their lives. They ran to Shia areas, which is another very interesting story for another time, and the influence that Mutazilism had on Shiism. So they were suppressed. They were forced out. This will help dramatize again the difference. So Abdul-Jabbar said, quote, "It is obligatory for you to carry out what accords with reason," unquote. That could be right out of Aristotle's Ethics. That's Al-Ghazali's teacher, Al-Juwayni, quote, "There is nothing obligatory by reason for the servant of God. Nothing." And Al-Ghazali himself, quote, "No obligations flow from reason, but from the Sharia," unquote. So the obligations you have are only from revelation, from Sharia, not from reason. Now, King Hussein, in the last interview he gave, it was to Milton Bjorst, an American journalist, was asked this question: "Would you agree that the Muslim decline can be dated from the 9th century, when Islam missed the chance to become the religion of reason and moderation by crushing the Mutazilite movement?" King Hussein answers, "That is essentially correct, and we must do what we can to change that now."
Muhammad was illiterate, correct?
Well, that's a point of contention. I
He could
mean,
not
he
write.
claimed, yeah, that's the thing, he could only recite that, yeah.
So he could not really have been, I would say, that great an influential person, because he depended on others to write down his musings, I would say.
Well,
I
it was
would
an
say he a
illiterate
great
society. I
philosopher.
mean, well, he didn't claim to be a philosopher. I mean, you
Oh, I
can't,
thought-
yeah, no, you can't. I think you're familiar with Al-Sisi's remark at Al-Azhar in 2014. You remember this? Let me read it to you, because it just simply reflects the distress that has come from the situation in which much of the Arab world finds itself. So he's saying this to the sheikhs of Al-Azhar. Quote, "It is inconceivable that the ideology we sanctify should make our entire nation a source of concern, danger, killing, and destruction all over the world. It has reached the point that this ideology is hostile to the entire world. Is it conceivable that 1.6 billion Muslims would kill the world's population of 7 billion so that they could live on their own? This is inconceivable. I say these things here at Al-Azhar before religious clerics and scholars. May Allah bear witness on Judgment Day to the truth of your intentions regarding what I say to you today. You cannot see things clearly when you are locked in this ideology. You must emerge from it and look from outside in order to get closer to a truly enlightened ideology. You must oppose it with resolve. Let me say it again. You need to revolutionize our religion. Honorable Imam, the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar, you bear responsibility before Allah. The world in its entirety awaits your words, because the Islamic nation is being torn apart, destroyed, and is heading to perdition. We ourselves are bringing it to perdition." Unquote. Well, I don't think there could possibly be a more powerful indictment or cry of alarm than what President al-Sisi said at that time. Now, Jack has a raised eyebrow. When is he going to stop? I just want to say something about why people are behaving the way Jack describes. Some Muslims are behaving that way. If I had a chalkboard behind me, I would draw in rough the general conception of the universe of existence held in common by the main monotheistic religions, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. You have the world, and above the world, utterly transcendent, would be Yahweh, Allah, God. You would have a message from God saying, "Here are my rules, here are my commandments. You behave this way, your eternal reward awaits you. Paradise, heaven, whatever. If you misbehave, hell, Gehenna, forever." So then, according to that behavior, you will meet your just deserts from a just God. That's sort of the general picture. Now, what has taken place, and what we, I think, understand as Islamism, is a breach between the transcendent and the terrestrial. And I thought I had it before me, but I can't find it at the moment, is the statement, not by Ibn Taymiyyah, but by our signposts guy, Claire. Signpost. Said Qutb. That makes explicit the breach between these two, and saying that the objective of man is to not wait for God's eternal justice before his throne, but to administer that justice now, and therefore approximate these conditions of paradise or hell here on this earth. The famous philosopher in the 20th century, Eric Voegelin, called this immanentizing the eschaton. There was actually a National Review button for a while, don't let them immanentize the eschaton, by which he meant don't take the end of existence, which is outside of the terrestrial, in the transcendent, and try to duplicate or immanentize it here, create it here, because that creates a huge disorder in existence. And that is what every modern ideology has tried to do, whether it's Marxism, Leninism, Nazism, and Islamism. It is doing precisely that. It is trying to immanentize the eschaton. And therefore, they think that the violence in which they engage, as you know, Jack, and as which we all know, is holy. Now, why aren't there stronger antibodies within Islam against this? And my contention is within the Sunni world, these antibodies aren't there because of the dominance of this theology, which prevents one from saying that acting unreasonably is against God, because God is reason. the possibility of saying that within the dominant theological school within Sunni Islam isn't there. So in other words, there's no breakwater, there's no place that these people can get within that version of Islam where they're stopped by Islam itself. They could keep going. In other words, it's a continuum. It doesn't mean that that's where all Muslims are going. Certainly, thank God, vast majority of them don't. But it's why you see the problem with, even within the Muslim world, of denunciations of what they do. And of saying, no, that's not Islam, those aren't Muslims. And when Al-Sisi challenges the sheikhs at Al-Azhar, they don't do it either. Nor have they responded favorably to his insistence on the reform of Arab educational institutions. And that's because this has become so entrenched. I spent a week with a number of Arab Muslim intellectual reformers. One was a Syrian, highly intelligent guy who said, I felt I was in a theological prison and I couldn't get out. Because he was entrapped in this very frame of mind that I have characterized for you that is Asharite. He said, it wasn't until I learned French that I escaped. And then we began having a theological discussion. It was very crude because I was trying to speak French, which he was completely fluent in. But he became so animated and excited when I said some of the very same things I did tonight about the Mutazilites, which is very familiar to everyone here because we've pretty much all been Hellenized. So this is the way he got tremendously, yes, that's it. Because of the relative novelty of this line of thought, which makes the problems that are being faced that we discuss so often here at Westminster, and so many of our speakers address, why it is so intractable, why it is such a problem, why a Millennium Challenge grant is not going to turn the Middle East around, because it's not fundamentally an economic problem. It's a theological problem, and it has to be addressed at that level. And there are some courageous Muslims who are attempting to do that. They usually have to do it out of their own countries because it's a very dangerous enterprise, but they do it. All right, please, I'm very sorry for having gone on for so long, but everybody jump in and talk about what you want. And anyone who wants to come up here and talk, do that. Yes?
Was Al-Sisi's argument theological? His argument, his extraordinary testimony when he made the points that you read, was that considered theological?
Philosophical.
It's not a theological statement. It's what I'd call it's a cri de coeur. It's a rhetorical statement.
So was it?
Saying, for heaven's sakes, do something or stop what you are doing. This is driving Islam in the world into an impossible situation. You have to turn this around. This cannot be our faith, a faith of destruction. So he was trying, and I found it extremely curious as I was galvanized by Al-Sisi's remark, waiting for the Western leaders to say something about it. There were certainly wonderful achievements in what you might call the Middle Ages in Islam, and most particularly in mathematics and optics, and some marvelous thinkers, to the point where you'd think that perhaps modern science could have taken off. It never did. It was completely stillborn, and largely is today, in the sense of original scientific research. The number of patents in the entire Arab world is eclipsed by the number in, say, South Korea. Now, I would proffer to you the explanation that the denial of cause and effect in the natural world subverts the effort of science because it makes the search for causes a thing of impiety. To ask about those sources is impious. And there's nothing inferior about what I'd call the Muslim mind or the Arab mind. Look at the achievement of Arabs in the United States. They're above the median. But it's the ones who are in that theological prison who can't engage in things like creative science. So science was stillborn. There were in the Muslim world. Done.
If they're so fatalistic, and we've heard about fatalism in a lot of contexts, if they're so fatalistic, why aren't they fatalistic about, say, the distribution of power in the Middle East, the existence of Israel, the prominence of the United States?
Or the global caliphate.
Yeah.
You know, God wants it, it'll come.
Well, you
So
see,
they're
you're
selectively fatalistic.
you're using a standard of reason which is inapplicable.
My mistake.
But the fact is, the Ben Jack, wait a minute, the idea that, what is on offer from certain imams or sheikhs is a hell of a lot better than a job or an education. It's a straight line to paradise, and you can bring others with you. This is not this is what they believe. This is why what they think they're doing is holy. So if they're killed, that's almost better than living and succeeding or failing. It doesn't matter if you fail if you're killed in battle, as you know that's very well. And it's the confusion of this, the terrestrial with the transcendent that leads to the great appeal of this. I found the Sayyid Qutb quote, so Chuck, if I could just read this and then over to you. Told you how important this is because Sayyid Qutb, the people most frequently quoted in Islamist literature and certainly in jihadi literature are Ibn Taymiyyah from the Middle Ages and Sayyid Qutb. And Sayyid Qutb relies on Ibn Taymiyyah. That's why both of them are the superstars. So here's what Qutb said, and collapsing this distinction between the transcendent and the terrestrial. Quote, Islam chose to unite earth and heaven in a single system. The patent purpose of establishing God's law on earth is not merely an action for the sake of the next world, for this world and the next are but two complementary stages. Harmonizing with the divine law does not mean that man's happiness is postponed to the next life. Rather, it makes it real and attainable in the first of the two stages. In other words, these transcendent ends will be achieved and instantiated by earthly means. So Qutb said, the goal is to reestablish the kingdom of God upon earth or to create a new world. So this is a metaphysical objective to change the very nature of reality. Like every modern ideology, the objective is to change the nature of reality. And the instrument for that change is certainly not reason. We saw reason has been discredited in sign language. It's violence. It's force. And until this is a war of ideas. And it has to be fought and confronted. And even in war, even every soldier on either side goes into battle with an idea weapon with him.